Welcome everyone to today's session with Leah and Danny. Thank you so much for being here and welcome everyone to this open and friendly space. Wherever you are, it's a come as you are kind of arena. And I just wanted to stress to our facilitators and attendees, try to be accessible as possible. That's our goal, to be inclusive. So try to describe visuals as much as you can. If there's any important text on the slides, please try to read it out loud. Thank you. Over to you, Danny and Leah.
All right. I am going to share my screen. And hopefully can I get some thumbs up or acknowledgement that you're seeing slides, not presenter view?
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Leah, I'm going to pass it to you.
Oh, okay. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our session today. My name is Lea Sansom. I am a librarian, a teaching and learning librarian at Western University, although we'll introduce ourselves a little bit more later. This session is Knowledge Justice in Digital Spaces, Navigating Algorithmic Bias. And Danny, if we can move to the next slide for the agenda. So today we're going to talk about a few different elements of this. We'll start with introductions and context for the project and for Danny and myself. We'll talk about epistemic injustice and algorithmic bias as concepts. We will have two sort of critical reflection activities and an activity that involves mapping algorithmic bias to epistemic injustice. The second part of the session will be talking about what knowledge justice is, and we'll have some discussion, including practicing knowledge justice in digital spaces. And then at the end, we'll finish with a reflection to action activity. Next slide, Danny.
And so we've tried to design this to reduce as many access barriers as possible. In the session, there are planned small group activities. Given the fact that we are a smaller group, we may end up in the main room. But however that is configured, you'll have the option to either choose to work in the group or to work individually. In terms of sharing, again, because we're a smaller group, we would invite input either by raising your hand and speaking out loud, by using the chat, or if you're here more to sort of reflect and work internally, that's another very acceptable form of participation. Our slides don't have a lot of images in them, but when there are key images that contain important information, we will stop and describe them. Captions can be controlled by each of you within Zoom, and that option should be on the Zoom menu for you. In the discussions, we invite lots of sharing and reflection, but you only need to share what you're comfortable sharing. So there's no obligation at any point to share or disclose anything. And then finally, if for any reason you're finding that you're not able to fully engage, you're not able to fully participate, please let one of us know, and we'll do what we can to adjust how we're presenting and how we're conducting the session to try and eliminate any barriers to access. So in this session, we have a couple of goals. So first, to define epistemic injustice, knowledge justice, and algorithmic bias, we'll start by kind of building that collective understanding of the terms that we'll be using in the session. Next, to understand the link between epistemic injustice and algorithmic bias, so how quite often our technologies have encoded biases that favor and value some forms of knowledge over others. And then finally, discussing how to apply a knowledge justice lens to online searching. So these are our goals, or our intended goals for the session. And of course, for whoever is joining us, we welcome you to kind of define your own goals as well, and we hope that we can help you meet those. So I'll pass it back to Lea, and we're just going to quickly introduce ourselves in relation to this work.
Yeah, so thanks, Danny. Like I said, my name is Lea. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a teaching and learning librarian at Western University in Ontario, Canada. Knowledge justice work specifically is something that I have been involved in since the start of my career as a librarian, which was only a few years ago. On the teaching and learning team at Western Libraries, we've been very committed to this work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I am also a white person. I am of settler descent, about 3 and 4 generations back here in Canada. My family is originally from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And what I like to say about myself is I just care a lot. I care a lot about leaving the world a better place than it is right now. And that's sort of my position on this type of work.
Thank you, Leah. So I'm Dani Dilkes. I also work at Western University, which is located in southwestern Ontario in Canada. I'm an educational developer there. So my role is really supporting instructors on how to build their courses, how to build their curriculum, and how to teach. And knowledge justice and sort of understandings of sort of systemic inclusion and exclusion are really core to how I approach that work. So often I'm thinking about whose voices are present in the courses we're building, who is able to participate in the way that we're designing those courses, and who is excluded. And I think some folks here might be aware of this, but simultaneously, I'm also a PhD student finishing my dissertation. So this past couple of weeks, I've been writing about that, and it's all focused on basically how exclusions are built into social designs and how society is structured in such a way to create a norm of who is and is not allowed to speak, who is and who is not allowed to participate, and others folks, and excludes them from those designs. And the hopeful outcome is changing those things. So I do approach and bring knowledge justice into a lot of my work, and more broadly through a design lens. Oh, thank you, Noreen. I was going to say
Yes.
exactly what you've just typed in the chat. We would really love to hear more about the folks who are in this room, both kind of where you're coming from geographically, but also where you're sort of positioned within education, but also how you're already thinking about knowledge justice. So if you're feeling comfortable, please do introduce yourselves in the chat. And while you do that, I will pass it back to Leah, who will give a little bit more of the journey to this moment.
Yeah, so to elaborate on what I said earlier about knowledge justice here at Western, for anyone who's unfamiliar, which may be most of you, Western libraries started doing epistemic justice work in about like early 2021. The teaching and learning team decided to investigate how we might decolonize Western libraries' information literacy learning outcomes. The result of that process, which was a very deeply reflective and sort of iterative process, was 6 new learning outcomes, which you can find on the Western Library's website. And you can read about everything that went into our unlearning process in the Canadian Journal of Academic Librarianship. Our colleague Heather Campbell and our colleague Dan Sitch wrote an article that's quite lengthy, but that goes into all the details about what the team went through in this process. On the screen, we have an image of the library curriculum title page with a link below that in the slides, and also a screenshot of the CJAL article that Heather and Dan wrote. So you can follow those links, and Dani is also helpfully popping them in the chat as I speak. If you're interested in learning more about what Western libraries did to get us to this point. But since then, since 2021, when we underwent this sort of decolonization process, the trouble we've been having is how do we actually do the work that we have now articulated we have our values for? And that is sort of a little bit more what Dani and I, a part of that is what Dani and I will be talking about today. And if we could pop to the next slide, Dani.
Oh. Is it not progressing, Leah?
Now it's on the right one, the knowledge
Okay.
justice and the helping professions. Yeah.
I think that my Zoom froze, so
Okay.
I thought I was on the next slide.
That's okay. And thank you everyone for introducing yourselves to the chat as well. So as we tried to ask ourselves, how do we actually teach to the values that we've articulated in the library? What Dani and myself and several of our other colleagues at Western have been working on for the last, well, at least a year, 6 months, 8 months, is an open educational resource titled Knowledge Justice in the Helping Professions from Theory to Practice. So a lot of the content from today's workshop is coming from or directly related to this forthcoming open educational resource that we've developed. It will be published in like probably less than a week. It'll actually be ready. It will be openly available via Pressbooks under a Creative Commons license. If you're interested in signing up, we do have a mailing list for anyone who would like to directly sign up to receive a link to the OER once it's ready. If you would like that, you can register to receive the OER at that QR code on the slide. There's also a direct link. That tiny URL that I just put in the chat should get you to the Google form that would let you sign up for the open educational resource. And probably throughout the day, throughout the session, if you find yourself asking, wait, but how do I actually do the thing you're talking about? Almost definitely, we probably answer that in the OER as well. So now, before we can start talking about knowledge justice and practicing knowledge justice, we also have to understand what we mean by epistemic injustice. So to start off, is anyone familiar with this term? Do you know what it means? Do you have a definition that you go by for epistemic injustice? Feel free to put it in the chat or raise your Zoom hand if you'd like to speak aloud. Is anyone already familiar with this term? And if not, that's fine too. Seeing silence in the chat and on the Zoom, I'm going to guess that means most people are unfamiliar or maybe just not familiar enough to feel, lots of different types. Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Yes, in fact, we're going to talk about all the different types of epistemic injustice in just a moment.
Also a very heavy term that you can't just describe in one sentence or one word, because it's very huge.
Which is very fair. So to get us further into the discussion then, Danny, if we could go to the next slide. So the definition of epistemic injustice that we're operating under for the most part in our work is that epistemic injustice is when people undermine, undercut, disvalue, curtail, exclude, outright dismiss, or in some cases, gaslight a person or persons in their capacity as potential knowers. That is not a definition we came up with ourselves. As you can see the citation here on the slide from Dunn 2020. Epistemic injustice at its core, in a simpler way, is injustice related to knowledge. If epistemic or epistemology isn't a term that's familiar, we mean the way that people are allowed to be knowers and to be knowledgeable. So if we could go to the next slide, Danny. Epistemic injustice is when others deny that our opinions are valid or that we are reliable because of our social identities. A good example of that would be who's considered a credible witness in court based on their social identity. Would be when people erase, discount, or destroy our language, cultural practices, and ways of knowing. An example of that would be the cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples by the Government of Canada. It would be when people purposefully keep us isolated from others who are like us or from folks with similar experiences. So a good example of that is the Me Too movement, where people felt up until that sort of moment very silenced to speak about sexual assault. Or it could be when people do not understand our needs, and we may not even understand them ourselves because people like us have been kept out of mainstream society. Good example of that is ableism silencing the voices of disabled people, and disabled people not being able to understand even sometimes their own experiences because the voices out there are just not speaking about it. So epistemic injustice actually is something that kind of goes by a lot of names depending on the theoretical framework you're approaching it from. So on the screen is again just that same definition I read out earlier. Danny, if you could advance one more. So Western libraries' approach with epistemic injustice was informed by a lot of different theorists and disciplinary backgrounds. In philosophy, Fricker talks about epistemic justice and specifically hermeneutical and testimonial injustice, which are different types of epistemic injustice. First Nations perspectives talk about cognitive imperialism, that's Marie Baptiste, and Candace Burnett-Debasquier talks about the empire of epistemologies. From a critical theory lens, we can see the discussion about coloniality of knowledge or epistemicide. In health sciences, they talk about epistemic exclusion. Decolonial theorists talk about epistemic violence. In library and information science, which is where I'm approaching things from and where several of our colleagues who helped us write the OER, as well as teaching and learning at Western libraries, this is where we're approaching things from. People talk about curricular injustice and knowledge justice. And so that's where Western libraries sort of landed on our term knowledge justice as a core principle of our library curriculum. And in social anthropology, people talk about cognitive justice, which is quite similar to knowledge justice, just a slightly different term. So in this way, you can see all of the different perspectives that are approaching the same sort of concepts in different ways. When Western libraries approach this work, a lot of library information literacy is based only in the ACRL framework of information literacy. If you're not familiar with libraries, most instructional librarians are teaching to that specific framework. But the Western Libraries curriculum, our goal was to actively address the ways in which Euro-Western definitions of knowledge are privileged, as well as the ways that academic work contributes to the silencing and elimination of diverse epistemologies, including Indigenous ways of knowing. So as you can see, the reason we chose this term knowledge justice is because of the work of a fellow librarian, Sophia Lung. But as we can see, again, there are many interrelated concepts, including from Indigenous scholars and Indigenous ways of knowing. So you can find the reading list, I think, at the end of our slides. Maybe, did we include that? And if not, at the very least, it will be in our open educational resource.
We can make sure that it goes out with folks.
Yes.
To folks.
Might have overlooked that, and I apologize. And so as we talk about what epistemic injustice actually looks like, one of the ways that we like to frame it, especially when we're teaching it, is to look at how that appears in our different disciplines. So Danny, if we could advance one more for the video. So nursing is a program that we've worked with very closely at Western Libraries, and one of our colleagues from nursing, Ashley McEwen, is a co-author on our open educational resource. So this video is an example from Joel Burvell, who is a nurse and an educator, talking about how nurses learn racism and racial stereotyping even in their nursing curricula, and then that is a form of epistemic injustice. So Danny, if we could play the video.
I'm just going to ask for confirmation that it's working because we did not test video playing.
Here's an example of how racist beliefs can even get passed down in medical
Was working.
textbooks. This is a picture from a 2015 nursing textbook. In the chapter about pain, it teaches nurses about common cultural differences that different ethnicities have. Jews apparently are more vocal and demanding of assistance. Black patients often report higher pain intensity and believe that suffering and pain is inevitable. Hispanics apparently believe that pain is a form of punishment and that it must be endured in order to go to heaven. The list goes on, and these assumptions are not evidence-based and reinforce harmful stereotypes. And I'll give you one guess at what race wasn't on this list, reaffirming once again that in medicine, whiteness is the norm.
So that's a great example from the nursing discipline, but we don't like to pick on just any one discipline because we recognize, and I'm already seeing some people talking about it in the chat, epistemic injustice exists everywhere in our culture, particularly in our North American education system. So we have a question for all of you. Danny, if we go to the next slide. If you could go to menti.com or scan the QR code and enter the code that's on the screen now, we will have a little discussion about epistemic injustice in our disciplines.
Oh, thank you, Irene. I was
Thank
just trying to get that in the chat.
Yep. So the question we're answering is, where have you encountered or witnessed epistemic injustices in your discipline, profession, or education, or really anywhere? And as I said, not to pick on any one discipline, and to get us started as people are collecting their thoughts, I will share one from librarianship from my perspective. I had to do a master's degree to become a librarian. And in library school, we learn about what being a librarian means, the values that underline our profession, all of those things. One thing that has really only recently started coming up in library school and library education is how libraries are colonial institutions by definition, and how libraries have actually played a role in the colonial project and in the oppression of Indigenous peoples, particularly in Canada. And so the fact that that has not been included in our education up until quite recently is an example of epistemic injustice, the silencing of certain voices and knowledges related to libraries' roles in colonialization. So we're seeing images that are not inclusive, so people aren't able to see themselves represented in images if they're used in education, for example, or really anywhere. Indigenous and any non-Western knowledge and science is often seen as less credible, despite the evidence saying otherwise, yet the erasure, the destruction, the discounting of forms or ways of knowing, centering of white male theorists in educational research, 100%, non-inclusive knowledge and lived experiences as a whole, especially towards people impacted by their disability and neurodivergence. Yeah, the ability for people to see their ways of knowing or ways of interacting with the world represented. Modality bias in course assignments, stereotypes about certain races, only citing white males from the global north, very little reference to scholars in Africa, 100%. So all of these are examples of epistemic injustice. And for those of you who may be familiar with universal design for learning, you're probably also seeing some overlap there in terms of how people are represented in learning experiences as well. So thank you very much for those contributions. Maybe we'll give it like one more few seconds if anyone's finishing up some last thoughts.
It's interesting how two of us or someone else, I know I wrote one of the images and someone else did, so that's interesting how we picked that up as the first one. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think what we'll find as we talk more about knowledge justice and epistemic injustice is that pretty much all of us have experienced it in some form, and a lot of the times we're experiencing things that other people can definitely relate to as well. So yeah, I think, Danny, shall we move on to algorithmic bias?
I do just want to acknowledge the last edition there, the limits of race-free UDL. I do a lot of work with universal design for learning and situating it within like the neurosciences, like the lens that it's taking, where it says sort of difference exists only in the brain, very much disregards the social experience of racialized folks, of kind of the stigma of neurodiversity versus the experience of neurodiversity. So I really appreciate that comment, because UDL too often is presented as a panacea, and it's just simply not. So now we're going to move into talking about algorithmic bias, and understanding that a lot of these experiences of epistemic injustice are encoded into social designs and social structures, but increasingly, they're also very pervasive in technological designs, in algorithmic design. And I do want to just start by explaining what is an algorithm. So I think sometimes we throw around these words without necessarily developing collective understanding. So algorithms are essentially instructions or rules that machines follow to perform tasks. Algorithms can either be hard-coded by a human, so the instructions are very clearly laid out. If this, do this, then do this, then do this. Or, as we're seeing with machine learning and with the rise of AI, they can also be created through machine learning, where systems are given a basic set of tasks, but then they form their own rules and algorithms. And importantly, machine learning, or algorithms that are generated through machine learning, exist within what is metaphorically called the black box, because people can't actually see the instructions that are being followed by machines. On the right here, I have a very simple and problematic, and we'll get to that, example of an algorithm that says if gender equals female, color equals pink. If gender equals male, color equals blue, print color. And we'll talk about sort of some of the biases that are embedded in that. In your daily life, everyone here is on Zoom, so I'm assuming everyone here is a technology user. In your daily life, you will encounter algorithms in all technologies that you use. Algorithms will recommend what to watch next on streaming services. They curate your social media feeds and tell your social media feeds what should or should not be displayed for you. They filter spam from your inbox. They're also used to categorize photos. So if you're doing a search for photos, quite often an algorithm decided what is appearing and not appearing in that photo. They can be used to detect fraudulent behavior in banking transactions. They can be used to assess applications for jobs before those applications even go in front of human eyes. And the list goes on and on and on. Essentially, if you are a technology user, algorithms are everywhere, curating your lives and impacting how you engage with the world and where information and where information is coming from and what information we're exposed to. I think I've frozen. Oh, okay. So I did want to share a video. This is actually a trailer for a documentary that if you're interested in algorithmic bias and exploring this further, I would highly recommend. But we're going to play this video to kind of give you a little bit more grounding on how bias is coded in these algorithms. Oh.
During my first semester at MIT, I got computer vision software that was supposed to track my face. It didn't work until I put on this white mask. I'm thinking, all right, what's going on here? Is it the lighting conditions? Is it the angle at which I'm looking at the camera, or is there something more? That's when I started looking into issues of bias that can creep into technology.
Our ideas about technology that we think are normal are actually ideas that come from a very small and homogeneous group of people.
Vast amounts of data at incredible speeds.
Everybody has unconscious biases, and people embed their own biases into technology.
This kid got stopped as a result of facial recognition misidentification, and then used that as justification to search you. This is an innocent child.
Racism is becoming mechanized.
Systemic issues are only going to be hardwired into new technologies.
It's not just face classification, it's any data-centric technology.
Every day, we are all being scored.
Who gets hired, who gets housing.
I am making predictions for your life right now.
The people who own the code deploy it on other people, and there is no accountability.
Management at Atlantic Towers wanted to install the facial recognition software. Pretty much turn this place into Fort Knox.
The technology is being rapidly adopted, and there are no safeguards.
We are socially controlled in a way that we don't see.
Technology that analyzes faces could be biased, but the company is pushing it anyway.
What demographic is it most effective on?
White men.
Show me that it's going to be fair, that it's legal, before you put it out. That's what we don't have yet.
It's going to take people coming together, striving for justice in this age of automation.
And I see in the chat there is a request for a link to the video, so just let me grab that. And so I find the video is a really kind of condensed introduction to the idea of algorithmic bias, and how pervasive it is, but often also how invisible it is. Because so many of these biases are so entrenched in our technologies that unless you actually experience the harms of algorithmic bias, you might not be aware of it being there and how it's kind of curating our lives. So now thinking about sort of this grounding in what algorithmic bias is, we're going to invite folks to return to the Menti and ask you what examples of algorithmic bias come to mind after watching the video or in your own experience. And it should be the same Menti code. So hopefully it advanced.
It did.
Okay. I love the first answer, LLMs as a whole. Yes, large language models in their entirety are systems built upon and that reinforce existing biases in all of the human data that's been used to train them, but also in the decisions on what data is used to train them and what data is excluded. So Gen AI tools as well, yeah. AI being used in federal government agencies and departments, including in police forces. Yeah, and in a number of different ways. So our cases will give some examples, but AI is used in these departments to determine who will reoffend. And so how should we sentence folks in the criminal justice system? Or to determine who should we hire? And basing that on who did we hire before? So it sort of reinforces socialized hiring patterns. Any other examples?
I would like to chime in here since people have already brought up LLMs and generative AI. Also, as we're talking about epistemic injustices, which I know we'll get into a little bit later, the idea of what things are trained on and that influences the algorithmic bias, and most of the time that's the written word, right? Which means excluding any knowledge that isn't communicated by the written word, oftentimes, especially in English, including entire knowledge systems that do not record their history or communicate in the written word. So it's a great example.
And to sort of add to that also, which written word. So these systems have a much more density of English resources. And then you sort of see other like languages. I have some training to the point where there are some languages where very few resources have been drawn on from those languages. So, all right. If folks are thinking about other ideas, you can continue to add to the Menti. Oh, I see algorithms. Oh, okay. No, it's updated. Algorithms on social media platforms that are designed to create hate between two different groups. Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit about the idea of echo chambers, but how social media curation is very much meant to reinforce this is what you think about. So I'm going to just tell you the same things you think about all the time. And it creates this divisiveness between people who think slightly differently. It will increase that gap between how they think. And then predictive learning analytics. Oh, I should not say this aloud because our institution is looking into learning analytics, but I so hate how learning analytics are used to try and tell the entire story of a student. And so much harm can be drawn from that. So thinking not just of how does algorithmic bias appear, but where does it actually come from? And we talked about that a little bit in terms of what data we're using to train systems. But if you think about the lifespan of an algorithm, the lifespan of a technology, social biases and algorithmic bias can be encoded in computer programs at any step in the development process of algorithms. So first, we talked about underrepresentation of social groups or perspectives in the data sets that are used to train these systems. The people who are actually building these systems may have very limited frames of reference. So they'll have a partial perspective and usually design the systems with themselves as users in mind. So any types of users that are outside of that group of programmers might not have their needs fully addressed within the designs, or might not see themselves represented or reflected in those designs. The biased labeling or categorization of data. So when we have humans kind of identifying data and applying these labels, all of their own inherent biases will appear in that process. The lack of diversity in user testing. So for example, testing only with users of certain demographics, which means we'll only catch the problems that those users experience. Self-sustaining feedback loops that reinforce and amplify biases. With generative AI, for example, what we're seeing now is that generative AI is trained on human data sets, but now it's creating its own artificial data sets and training itself. So all of those biases that were encoded in that original data set are simply being reinforced as it goes through this sort of self-sustaining feedback loop where none of those biases are being addressed. And then finally, a misalignment of user needs and algorithmic objectives. And this is a really big one. And this is, again, when we talk about any sort of social design, often companies are interested in sort of the financial aspect, the money that they're earning. And so it can be expensive to address these biases. It can be expensive to create more accessible environments, more inclusive spaces. So if they don't see a return on investment there, quite often, even if they realize that these biases exist, there's no impetus for them to fix it. And this misalignment underscores a lot of why systems, even when we know that they're broken, aren't going to be fixed because there's a different set of values driving those changes. Lea, I don't know if you wanted to add anything there.
All good.
Okay. So AI was mentioned a couple of times. And so we do have a video. We won't play the whole video, but it's a TikTok video that sort of talks about bias in generative AI. On the video, I think it's the same actor talking to himself, as happens on TikTok. But one person has images coming up on the screen. And at the end, I'll sort of describe what's happening there. But essentially, they're talking about sort of how generative AI tools are really systems of perpetuating bias.
Can you believe this person is claiming AI is racist? It is. Ableist too. Prove it. Okay, let's ask it to generate an autistic person. So, and let's do it again. And once more.
I'm going to pause for a second just to describe what's happening on the screen. They're generating images in response to the prompt generate an autistic person, and all of them are white males of a certain age.
And again. And then. And how about... Are we starting to see a pattern? You seem to think you're proving something. Here's more. And more. And some more. And how about this? And another one. More. 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 Do you see any diversity, say race, gender, age? Oh. Plus, most were skinny and, weirdly enough, a disproportionate abundance of red hair. How many did you do until you gave up after more than 100? And the closer you look, you start to notice other trends. Like, were any of them smiling? It was all moody, melancholy, depressing. I noticed you used lifelike, photoreal, and photojournalism in your prompts. When I didn't include those, I'd get puzzle pieces in everything. Some of these are cartoons, others are whatever this is. Ugh. So AI is racist, sexist, ageist, and not only ableist, but uses harmful puzzle imagery from hate groups like Autism Speaks.
And I will pause it there. But just a good example of how some of the biases might be more visible once you start to see them, but these sort of ingrained ideologies, for example, using the puzzle images from an autistic hate group, might be more subversive and could show or could lead to kind of reinforcing these ideas or these connections in folks who might not be aware of those things. All right, so thinking about this example and the discussion that's already come, we're going to ask you to return to the Menti. I'm just going to flip to the Menti screen. And our next question asks, what harm What harm can algorithmic bias cause? We already see some answers here, but I'll give folks a moment to respond as well. So for folks who might not be familiar with word clouds, essentially what happens is bigger words mean more people have put that term in. So in the center, the biggest word is exclusion. Absolutely. I think that's at the root of everything that we're talking about when we're talking about knowledge and justice. But there are other kind of more personal and social implications of algorithmic bias. So false information, poor knowledge, or even I would say sort of perpetuating knowledge biases, knowledge colonization, so reinforcing the position of power that certain knowledge systems, knowers, and ways of knowing hold, injustice. We see racism and sexism, so again, reinforcing these systems of oppression. But then also on a personal level, depression, it can create feelings of not belonging if people are not seeing their own ways of knowing, their own identities reflected in these systems. And so a lot of the work that Lea's done is sort of built around this idea of harms and the harms of knowledge injustice. And so a couple of other things just to comment on. When we think about harms, they can range from mild inconvenience. So for example, if you have a streaming tool and it doesn't recommend a movie that you would really enjoy, that could be sort of annoying. But they can have significant social, health, or financial impact. So when we see algorithmic bias in algorithms that determine who's eligible for certain levels of insurance, or in medical systems, if it's determining who's allowed to get treatment and who's not, who's allowed to get a loan and who's not, they can have very significant long-term impacts on how we navigate society. Typically, and this will probably not be surprising to this group, the harms of algorithmic bias tend to impact those who are already harmed by social bias the most significantly. And many of the harms of algorithmic bias, not all, but many, are forms of epistemic injustice. If we're thinking about sort of the alignment between algorithmic bias and epistemic injustice, we can see how algorithms can devalue the experience and knowledge of individuals based on skewed metrics. In one of the cases, we'll dive into this a little bit. Systems can be designed to only allow for specific possibilities or ways of being that do not align with an individual's own experiences and needs. So here we can see sort of encoded ableism, where there's ways where we only define certain ways of participating that will exclude others from participating. And then finally, algorithms can reach the limit, or can limit the reach, not reach the limit, can limit the reach of certain voices or exclude them entirely. So when we have algorithms like search results that determine whose voices are returned if you do a Google search, or who's amplified on social media, that can have a very big impact on who becomes a prominent voice and who is sort of being made to be invisible or erased.
And if I may just chime in, Danny, just to get at sort of one of the keys of what we want to get to today is that algorithmic bias is both a result of epistemic injustice and also, as we can see here, reinforces and creates epistemic injustice. So as Danny talked about earlier, the ways that epistemic injustice manifests, defines, or limits who can be in positions of power, who can influence how the algorithms are written. For George's example in the chat from earlier, that who makes decisions about what projects a team focuses on or what a company's priorities are, can be the result of epistemic injustice, excluding certain voices, certain identities, etc. And also algorithmic bias reinforces epistemic injustice, reinforces our ideas about who is allowed to speak on certain topics, who is allowed to exist in certain places, and all of that.
So now we're hoping to give folks a an opportunity to look at some real life cases of algorithmic bias that are forms of epistemic injustice. And we are using actually ChatGPT to create a random generator. So you can also reflect on sort of that meta level of what biases might be built into this tool. But what we're going to do is, I'm just looking at the time. Lea, what do we think? Do we still want to do it in breakout rooms, or do we want to keep everyone in the main room?
I mean, I think we're having pretty good discussions in the main room. Maybe we could do it that way.
So what I will do is I'm going to put a link in the chat. And the link is a random generator, and I'll bring it up here as well. But essentially what we've done is we've found 6 kind of real cases of algorithmic bias. And for each case, we'd ask you to sort of reflect on a few questions. So what is the root cause of the algorithmic bias in the example? What harm is caused by this example of algorithmic bias? How does the algorithmic bias reinforce or mask systemic inequities? And who is being silenced, discredited, or excluded from knowledge production, validation, or access? So I will bring this up on my screen as well. But maybe what we'll do is give folks 2-3 minutes to kind of play around with the tool, find a case and reflect on it, and then we'll invite kind of conversation on them. And if for whatever reason, either if you do not wish to use ChatGPT, which I fully understand, or if otherwise the generator is not working for you, all of the cases are also in the slides. And can I ask someone to just drop the slides in the chat again in case some folks didn't grab them before?
So we still have time until the end of session. Would you guys like breakout rooms or
We're not going to do breakout rooms this time because we actually have, there's lots more after this.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's great.
And thank you, Noreen, for reposting the slides. And on my screen, maybe if my screen sharing is working. I have the generator here up. So for folks who are using the generator, you would just click on the pick random item and it would bring up an example of a case with a link to the example. But we'll give folks maybe another 2 minutes to kind of look through these, and then we can bring one up and discuss.
Would you like us to pause until everyone reads the cases and tries to answer discussion questions, or would you like to?
I think I should have reminded you to pause, and I did not. But I think we're kind of playing around. Was there any cases that stood out to anyone that you'd like to kind of bring up? Or we can just look at one or two. But if anyone, I'll invite first if anyone wants to either unmute themselves and talk about a specific case that you found intriguing, or if you want to drop something in the chat. Was there a case that stood out to anyone?
I could start with the English language. It's because it's believed that we learned English as a second language or the third language and stuff. So when we write very good English, everybody flags it, you know. I have a case where someone that I thought was a friend of mine about 2 months ago actually told me that I'm writing like AI, which was very, yeah, they were like, oh, is this you writing or did you get this from AI? So it tells you the biases that are there about the kind of language or the kind of English language that we write, or the written English that we do, that is, yeah. So that actually reminded me of that story, which is not very nice, because then
it's very interesting, the assumptions that people make about language production, and again reflects like existing linguistic discrimination, Irene. And I'm sorry that somebody said that to you, because that's also just frustrating. Like for me at least, there's such a strong connection between how you write and who you are. So for someone to question your writing and say, well, was this AI? It feels like there's like a bit of an attack on your identity. So I don't know if you experienced it that way.
It was well, actually it was a white American male, so long story, but that's one of those things that happen. But it taught me a lot more about the biases that we have, and the assumptions that people have around a lot of the people that we meet in our path in life. So yeah, so that was interesting. Yeah, thank you.
And I want to also acknowledge Caitlin's comment in the chat. So one of the first case was about shadow banning, and how some systems will make more invisible posts that are flagged as being too political or with certain ideological leanings. And the example here was about the Black Lives Matter movement, but we see this a lot with, as Caitlin says in the chat, things around Palestine or Gaza, and other things that really are just up to the kind of ideological leanings of the people in charge of the tech company. So we're giving over a lot of our ethical curation to people, and we need to think about sort of who the people are who are making these decisions on what is or is not ethical and what should or should not show up on our social media feeds.
And often what we see then is that being profit motivated at its core. What is appealing to advertisers, what they can sell versus what might jeopardize profits, right? So.
And then George says that case 2, recruitment by algorithm, has just surfaced at his university. Do you want to speak more to that, George?
Yes, and excuse me for not coming on camera. I'm just, it's spotty connection today. So this one is actually as much about my students as anybody else, because I'm at a public state university in California, part of the Cal State system, and we've really gone full in with ChatGPT and everything, including us paying OpenAI a significant sum to contract and so on. And so it's everywhere. And that's its own issue that probably fits into other categories. But the other thing going on, our career development people, the people who are supposed to be essentially getting our students jobs on the way out of university, are realizing that there's a problem, because the same companies that are pushing the technology are also doing massive layoffs. And so our computer science students, our business students, and, not necessarily our humanities students, are suddenly finding maybe their entry-level jobs are disappearing. And that is something that I know I personally am having trouble getting my head around, but I also teach students who are first-year students. And it's like, well, this is what we told you to get you here, right? And public state universities are all about the workforce and, and all of that, as well as liberal education and what we're, faculty, I think, tend to focus on. So it's right now it's this new puzzle. Like, okay, what are we doing this for again? And knowing that the recruitment itself is by the companies that we want students to engage with are just as likely to be recruiting by algorithm as to do their recruiting the conventional way. And this is, I don't even think our career people have gone that meta yet with it, but fortunately we're a small campus and we're colleagues and friends. And so actually want to take this to the next conversation with our career development people who are going to be visiting our first year classes starting in just a few weeks. So I'm wondering if anybody else has comments or ideas on this one as well in the room, because right now it's a new puzzle. And so I'm kind of overwhelmed by just thinking about, I've got, like 90 students coming in a few weeks of my own, let alone the rest of the campus. And I don't even know what to tell them right now.
I'll leave it open in case anyone has a response to George, and then I do have something I want to say, but if anyone else has a response, again, either in the chat or you're welcome to unmute yourselves. So I appreciate that you said it's a new puzzle. I would argue that it's actually a new lens on an old puzzle. Because I think what's happening is education is now doing two things. Like you said, it's sort of that pipeline to work, and students are seeing it as very instrumentalized to, this is the job I want, so this is the program I need to take. And that's sort of leading to the death of the humanities and the arts. And so if we're thinking about how do we game the algorithms, I think that's a really good metaphor for how students are moving through school. Like, how do we game school so I get the outcome I want, which leads to the career I want, versus how do we change the algorithms? How do we change the system so they're not reinforcing these things? And I don't have an answer to your problem, George, but what you've really made me think about is like that tension between, do we teach students how to move through the system as it is and put the best things on their resume so the algorithm picks up on them as the best applicant, or do we teach them to actually critically interrogate those systems? And I don't have the answer, but I appreciate the moment of reflection in that metaphor. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
I think in the interest of time, we may have to move on from the discussion.
Okay, so quick summary on algorithmic bias. Essentially, algorithms replicate and perpetuate human biases, but often because they're so ingrained, both in the systems and in the social, they're often invisible. So we're not aware of these biases until somebody says, hey, look, this is what's really happening. The harm of algorithmic bias can vary widely from inconvenience to significant social exclusions. And as we've sort of been discussing, and I'll pass it back to Lea to bring us back to the epistemic injustice conversation, many forms of algorithmic bias are really just encoded forms of epistemic injustice. And back to you, Lea.
Thanks, Danny. So we've spent the first half or 2/3 of this session talking about epistemic injustice and algorithmic bias and how those can harm people, how they can hurt people, the implications. But at the same time, I mean, it's an interesting actually tie into, are we working within a system? Are we challenging the system? We do have all these online tools that actually have also contain a wealth of knowledge that we maybe need to be drawing on. So now we're going to talk about how we can use existing digital online tools to use a knowledge justice informed approach when we're seeking out new knowledge or seeking out voices. So, Danny, if we could get the definition on screen. Knowledge justice, the definition that we work with, is that knowledge justice is based on the principle that every person has the equal capacity to be knowledgeable, yet this right is often denied to individuals based on the social identities they hold. It also involves recognizing that some knowledge systems, particularly those of Indigenous peoples, have been purposefully ignored, silenced, or actively eliminated. And as we've talked through amongst ourselves how we do this, we have the second part of this definition of how we practice it. To practice knowledge justice, we must challenge the dominance of Euro-Western systems and act on our responsibility to engage in meaningful dialogue across multiple and diverse perspectives. This requires approaching our own ways of knowing with humility, acknowledging the edges or limits of what we understand. By so doing, we can learn to see the world through multiple ways of knowing and approach diverse epistemologies with an open mind. So, what does this look like, and why does this matter when we're engaging with online tools? Well, I think we can recognize that in addition to algorithmic bias excluding people from online spaces, like we talked about shadow banning online, for example, Online spaces are also a place where people who have been historically excluded from dominant conversation, like academic publishing, can also speak and can make their voices heard. So our team has developed what we call the Voices Flower. It's a framework of understanding whose voices we need to draw on and where we might find them, rather than relying on understanding that where someone is speaking validates or invalidates what they are saying. So even though we recognize that online tools can cause harm via algorithmic bias, that alone can't be our way of defining whether or not someone who is speaking there is valid or not. So Danny, if we can move to the next slide. This is what we just want to talk about, what knowledge justice looks like for both of us before, sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit before we move into our framework. Knowledge justice looks very different depending on who you are and where you are, what your profession is, and that will change how you practice it. So just to contextualize a little bit, as a librarian, specifically a teaching and learning librarian, I am responsible for teaching students about how to find knowledge, or information seeking, as we often call it. That's a big responsibility. I am often a voice of authority for what knowledge is valid and where to find it. We're brought in by faculty colleagues into their classrooms as quote unquote experts on this knowledge seeking to teach their students, because we're recognized as people with specialized education, right? At the same time, I rely on being invited in by faculty. And so that does change the way that I am able to practice knowledge justice. Unlike a faculty member who is teaching a course that is under their control, I have to work with my faculty partners and I have to understand where they're at in their journey of practicing knowledge justice. It also means that often we are teaching faculty members using our library curriculum. We don't just teach students. So that all puts me in both a position of power to bring knowledge justice into the classroom, and also my need to partner with faculty and inside a system that is harming all of us at the same time. It's quite a complex sort of relationship that I'm navigating when I practice this work. Danny?
So similar to Lea, I'm in a position where I get invited into conversations. And what I try and do is, even though many of my conversations are not directly related to knowledge justice, I try and bring in moments of reflection with instructors on thinking about who is informing the design of their courses, their pedagogical practices, and how we can expand that understanding of expertise. In my doctoral research, I'm exploring what I call an emergent pedagogy and using co-design as pedagogical practices. So relying on the lived experience of learners as experts in learning to inform how we create more inclusive learning experiences and how we understand the barriers that are created in our educational designs. My background's also highly interdisciplinary, so I do a lot of what I would call interdisciplinary code switching. So I can draw on different epistemic traditions and draw on different sort of theoretical framings and try and bring them together in conversation in a way that's very, that contradicts a lot of what people say we need to do, which is like you choose like your lane. Instead, I kind of weave between all of the lanes in a lot of my work. And try and encourage instructors to do the same so we can have that kind of multi-perspective in how we approach education.
All right, so this is where I jumped ahead of myself too before we framed our own personal practices. So this is the framework for seeking voices and not sources, what we call the Voices Flower ourselves, that our team has been developing. Once again, on the screen is a QR code to sign up for our open educational resource mailing list that it will be published soon. If you want to read the whole book that we wrote basically about this. But in short, the Voices Flower, the graphic that you see on screen, is a 5-petal flower with some different colors that are mostly just there for aesthetics. But the 5 petals of the flower are interlinked and overlapping. They are persons with lived experience, community organizations, arm's length observers, power holders, and care providers. The petals on this graphic essentially represent the different voices or identities that may be speaking on a topic. And this is not just something that we can consider when we're talking about like academic research. We can think about this in our professional practice in whatever that may look like, or even just when we're researching something on our own and whose voices we can and maybe should be listening to. As you can see, the petals are overlapping, representing that individuals may hold more than one intersecting identity and that no one person can speak to an entire group. Essentially, we use this graphic to demonstrate that any of these voices have the equal capacity to be knowledgeable and to be knowers, rather than placing any one type of voice at the peak of a hierarchy, which is what often happens, right? That there are many different ways to be a knower and to be knowledgeable, and none of them should be immediately placed above one another for sort of arbitrary reasons. So to go a little more in detail with this framework, Danny, if we could go to the next slide. I'll go a little more in detail on what each of these voices is. So with power holders, what we mean by that are people like governments, well, people, entities, institutions, people, whatever you want to say, governments, lawmakers, academics, healthcare institutions, or regulatory bodies, essentially those who have the power to enact policies, laws, and things like that. When we talk about arm's length observers, we're talking about journalists, academics, research institutions that observe and report on phenomena without necessarily being directly embedded in the experience. So even though someone with lived experience can also be an arm's length observer, for example, typically the perspective that these voices are speaking from is not one internal to a community or a lived experience. You go to the next one, Danny. Representative groups, we mean advocacy groups, nonprofit agencies, indigenous governments, community organizations. These are groups that are typically made up of or in some way entitled to speaking for, advocating for people with specific lived experiences. The important thing here is that representative groups are sort of granted their authority by the people that they claim to be speaking for. So a group cannot be representative without the direct input of the people with lived experience. For care providers, those would be things like healthcare workers, alternative traditional practitioners, midwives, doulas, sometimes like religious advisors or counselors, and others who provide care outside of dominant models, or sometimes also this would be the individual providing the care within, for example, an institution or something like that. And then finally, if we could go to the next one, Danny. Individuals with lived experience and their loved ones. So really, the people with lived experience, yeah, sorry, Kathy, I see your question in the chat. Can care providers also be family members and friends? Yes, absolutely. A good example would be actually tied directly into this. Someone with lived experience, someone providing care for a family member with a particular illness, for example, would be both a care provider and an individual with direct lived experience of being a family member of someone with that illness. We recognize that individuals with lived experience are often the voices that are most excluded or silenced. They often don't receive the same funding, for example, and they might be speaking in places outside of where we're typically taught to search for information or knowledge. Thank you, Caitlin. Really, what we're trying to do is counter the silences and distortions in dominant knowledge structures by highlighting and bringing to the forefront individuals with lived experience and holding those voices in balance with all of the other types of voices that we've just discussed. And not saying that one is better or worse, but rather that they all have a place in understanding something, in building our own knowledge, in knowledge sharing and knowledge seeking. So if we can move to the next one, Danny. When we talk about knowledge justice, there's a few things we also want to remember. Practicing knowledge justice is messy, it's complex, it's nuanced, but it's also necessary. It's a difficult thing to say exactly how to do. We're trying our best. But one of the key things is that we're concentrating on holders of knowledge rather than just sources of knowledge. So who is speaking rather than where they are speaking. As we said, people can be in multiple places on the flower. One type of source doesn't exist only in one place necessarily. We never want to pigeonhole or stereotype certain voices into existing in only one place. And we also don't want to force representation onto individual voices. So I may have one person with lived experience saying one thing about a topic, and another person who also has lived experience is going to say something different, probably. The point is being able to hold those voices in balance with many other voices and not force one person or one piece of knowledge to speak for an entire group or life experience. I will say before we move on, one second, that balance is the key to all of this, where we don't want to only be listening to one type of voice. It's always about holding, and also multiple ways of knowing. We want to hold multiple ways of knowing, multiple voices in balance, attention with one another, and recognize the boundaries and limits of where one piece of knowledge is and how we can address those boundaries and limits by bringing in other forms of knowledge. So now that we have this on the slide, we're going to have a little discussion. And again, Dani, do you think we should do breakout rooms or just have the discussion as a group?
I think it's okay to just have the discussion in the main room.
Yeah. So we're just going to talk a little bit about voices in digital tools and online spaces. We're still tying this back to algorithms, algorithmic bias. So the questions that we have that anyone can feel free to speak aloud, put it in the chat, any of the answers to these questions. Whose voices might we find in digital spaces or using digital tools? How can we balance the inherent bias in the tools we use with the necessity of using them? And in general, how could these tools help us practice knowledge justice? There's no right answer. Would just love to hear your thoughts. And thank you, Noreen has also just put the questions in the chat as well. Kathy.
Hi, it's probably easier to explain my example rather than put it in the chat, if that's okay.
That's totally fine.
So the project that I've been working on for a little while is looking at literature search tools. So this will be of interest to you as a librarian.
Yes.
So I'm supervising a doctoral researcher who told me that she was only going to be using Scopus AI, so a Gen AI literature search tool, to do her literature review for her doctoral thesis. So I said, well, doesn't it concern you that maybe it's going to be biased and it's only going to give you results from white men in the USA and Europe, and that maybe you won't get so many studies from women in global majority countries? And she said, yeah, that does bother me. So we tested this theory out. We tested 5 different Gen AI literature search tools and compared them with 5 traditional databases, which of course some of them also incorporate some Gen AI elements. We've been using them for a long time and assuming that they're not biased, when of course they are. And we didn't find what we expected, actually, although there was quite a lot of difference between some of the individual tools. We looked at 4 different topics, and we put in the same prompt to all of these 10 different tools or databases, and we logged the first 20 results, and then we looked to see how many of those results were authored by women, and we looked at the lead author, and then we looked to see where their affiliation was and which country they were based in. So in terms of gender, the Gen AI tools and the traditional databases, when we compared the 5 with the 5, there was no discernible difference. And we didn't find what we expected for the geographical biases, because the Gen AI tools actually gave us 10% more results from global majority countries. So yeah, lots to think about there, but it's been an interesting project for us.
Well, yeah, that's super interesting. And thank you for sharing that, because yes, as a librarian, it's all very interesting to me. And actually, related to this, our colleagues who are also co-authors on our open educational resource do a lot of work with systematic and scoping reviews or knowledge synthesis projects, where the search strategies they're using are strictly defined, and there isn't a lot of work done on necessarily how to find diverse voices in a systematic or scoping review. So they're going through sort of similar questions. And one thing that I would say is also, like, the knowledge justice lens in this case, what you're doing there, looking at how the AI tool performs compared to a traditional literature search is really interesting, in terms of how, like, the algorithmic bias exists within that tool. And then also it's important to remember that algorithmic bias and also epistemic injustice means that inherently within those databases, there is that bias of who got published in the first place. But it is really interesting to hear, like, it's one of those questions which we often can't answer. It's like, how was the AI trained and why is it returning those types of results? And will it continue to do that? Will it get better at surfacing more diverse perspectives and authors? Will it get worse? That is, yeah, super interesting. Thank you, Kathy. Any other reflections or thoughts from anyone on any of these questions? And if not, that's okay. But if anybody, feel free to put anything in the chat as we continue. I want to address a couple of things as we move on, and I know we're running short on time already, which always happens. Just a couple of my own reflections on some of those discussion questions. What I think I want to make sure we get at is that digital tools, I mean, it's even with Kathy's example of the, like, AI search tool, and the fact that a lot of academic databases are starting to embed AI search tools within themselves already, right? Or social media, or using Google to search for government documents, right? We can't avoid using these tools in a lot of cases. We can make choices sometimes, like, I don't want to use the AI search, or I do based on, you know, this new information that I have. But often we're kind of trapped in using those tools in one way or another. Even an academic database, if you're searching online, it is embedded with that bias in and of itself, right? So when we're using a knowledge justice lens, it doesn't mean that we ignore these digital tools, or that if you're using digital tools, you are by definition not doing things through a knowledge justice lens. And in fact, a lot of the times these tools can help us to find voices that we need or that have otherwise been excluded. We just have to be mindful in our interactions with them because of algorithmic bias and its ties to epistemic injustice. Again, Kathy, thank you so much for that example. It's a great example of being mindful in the way that you're engaging with the tool. Maybe you don't find the exact thing you were expecting. Actually, that AI tool might be really helpful. But we're thinking about it in a mindful way and approaching it with that thoughtfulness that we don't want to reinforce harm. And so sometimes that means searching on social media. That means using blog posts, podcasts, any other first-person perspective that you might not find on a government document or in an academic database, right? And now, Danny, if we can move to the next slide. Often when we talk about these things, when we tell people that you should also be searching outside of academic databases or outside of, you know, official publications, that you can look for knowledge beyond what has been traditionally published, that lived experience has value as knowledge, equal value to other forms of knowledge. We're often, perhaps unsurprisingly, met with some hesitance about the reliability of social media posts, and other first-person perspectives, especially in the context of algorithmic bias. How can I even know that, for example, the person claiming to have this first-person experience online is even telling the truth, right? So are we saying that we should blindly trust anything that we find online? Absolutely, we are not saying that, no, for many of the reasons that we've already discussed, right? There is no shortage of misleading information online. Dis, and malinformation run rampant. These things can be deliberate, they can be innocently shared, but incorrect information. But there are a lot of harms involved, as we've already talked about. But we can't ignore these online spaces. So what we want to emphasize is that the capacity for harm, just in the same way as capacity to be a knower, capacity for harm lives in a person and not in the type of source. Someone can go into a class and teach a university level undergraduate course during the day and then go and troll people online for fun at night. the person themselves are doing that, it's really not the format that is saying that that person is or is not reliable, right? The reliability and the ability to cause harm is not defined by the type of source, and the person is at the center, much in the same way that the person is at the center in terms of capacity to be knowledgeable. If we could go to the next slide, Danny. So when we talk about this, when we talk about finding voices in online spaces, we developed, this is also in the open educational resource, a framework of evaluating for how things can cause harm rather than evaluating by the type of source, right? So rather than defaulting to saying that one source type is more reliable than another, we can look at how harm can be caused by knowledge. And you'll see a lot of this that also relates to algorithmic bias. The framework of harms falls into these categories. We can look at profit over people, misusing or falsifying authority, theft of knowledge, exclusion, deletion, and censorship, and bigotry and harmful language. We already talked about a lot of this in our discussion of epistemic injustice and algorithmic bias. Examples would be things like clickbait or prioritizing controversial content in the interest of AdSense. Influencers selling health products, relying on their authority as an influencer to act as an authority on healthcare, which is probably not a reliable source, right? Bots stealing and reposting content, social media being censored for political interests, bigotry being spread in comment sections, or even someone pretending to be an identity that they're not in order to spread misinformation, right? So we want to keep all of that in mind, and these questions are good things to ask ourselves when we use these online tools to seek out diverse perspectives. So again, it's about remembering that we can find valuable knowledge and also it can be used to cause harm. If we could go to the next slide, Danny. There are also special considerations for AI generated content, which is becoming more and more rampant, right? So it's difficult to know exactly if something is AI generated unless someone tells you explicitly, but there are some considerations that we can make if we do know something is AI generated. Things like who owns the company, what's their mandate, and is that information available? Great question to ask. Like, what is the intention of the company? Are they being transparent? How was their model trained? What are the boundaries of the model? What is it allowed to talk about? What is it censored from talking about? And all of that really relates to transparency from the companies. And these are questions we could be asking when we engage with AI tools as assistants in seeking knowledge. We also need to know why they are the way that they are. So we could go to the next one, Danny. Bringing it all together. Sorry, we're running out of time. Hopefully, though, you can start to see through a knowledge justice lens how digital tools and online spaces can help us find people and voices that have been silenced in other places. And also that we need to approach these things with caution and through a knowledge justice lens to prevent ourselves from replicating the harm caused by epistemic injustice and algorithmic bias. Can you go to the next slide, Danny? When we use a knowledge justice lens, we can hold multiple voices in balance and understand where those voices might be silenced. We can find lived experience and diverse voices online. We can also practice mindful exclusion by recognizing how knowledge can cause harm, and we can choose whose knowledge is too harmful to include in our whatever we're doing. And we can challenge epistemic injustice and minimize the harm that we cause to others by remaining mindful of all of these things and approaching things through a knowledge justice lens. Thanks, George. Yeah. And I don't think we have time for our last couple of activities, Danny.
I don't think we do. So we can invite folks if you want to share what you're taking away today. You're welcome to share that in the chat. But we'll also just open it up for questions and I will stop sharing.
And as a reminder, if you are like, wait, but how do I search online in a knowledge justice way? The open educational resource that we are publishing very soon does go through this in a lot more detail. So just as a reminder.
I'll just say thank you to everyone. I know folks are dropping off for their next meeting, but thank you to everyone for contributing to the conversation because it's so rich kind of having the conversation from so many different perspectives. So every time we talk about this, I think we learn as well, which is the point, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Dani
you.
and Lea, for an insightful session.
Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you, Irene and Noreen, for facilitating and keeping us
Yes.
organized and all of that
Of
helpful
course.
stuff.
Our pleasure.
Okay.
Say bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.